Kathleen A. Campion Foundation was established in 1993 following the 1989 death of Kathleen, age 20, who was killed by an alcohol-impaired driver in Saratoga County. At the time of her death, she was a junior attending SUNY Albany who planned to continue her education at Albany Law School, hoping, one day, to prosecute alcohol-impaired drivers. The foundation is administered by Kathleen's family and focuses on the raising of DWI awareness and support for crime victims.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Looking Down the Road, where we examine the intersection between law enforcement and road safety. When a law is passed that makes our roads safer, there's the signature of the governor that makes that the final step. But before that, there are many steps, many people who work on that process, and today I have an expert who can elaborate on that process today for all of you. It's Tom Louizou, and let me just give you a little bit on his background. Tom is the retired National Safety Administration Administrator with over 40 years experience in traffic safety policy, planning, implementation, training, stewardship for highway safety grant programs, and he also is currently volunteering and working for the road safety boards that include .05 Save Lives Coalition, which he's the co-founder of, and the National Road Safety Foundation. So I guess I want to start with many people have an experience that inspired them to get involved with this. And I, as you know, with my mother who founded RID, her process was twofold. First, there was this horrible tragedy, and then she learned that the drunk driver who caused it got to keep his license that same day and went home that same day. So she was able to see the injustice of it, and that's what motivated her. Was there an experience that you had that had a similar effect?
Well, fortunately for me, there was not. It was I was trained as a teacher when I got out of school. My first job actually ended up with the Department of Motor Vehicles, so I had no personal experience with a tragedy or a crash. And it was with the driver safety program, which was a 3-hour class at the time, and now a 5-hour pre-licensing program. From that, I ended up at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. So I've had a career in driver safety, roadway safety, that made me sensitive to these issues. And I saw the tragedies up close, the personal issues that were all impacting. And it wasn't just one individual, but it was whole families, whole communities that are impacted by road safety.
Well, how did you have that? How were you privy to that experience, or did people contact you, or were you just aware of?
I was aware of it through the job. It was a grant program where we provided money to the states to enforce DWI laws, to enforce the safety belt laws. So I went to many meetings where there were victims advocates, many meetings and conferences where the citizens were there testifying and available for presentations. So I basically became very sensitive to these issues just through my career. Lasted 40 years at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and then from that got involved with the NTSB, former chair, to decide to advocate for lower BAC laws, because we saw the benefit of it. We saw the benefit of Stop DWI in New York State.
Mm-hmm. Now in 1982 there were, I believe, 7 RID bills that were passed that had never been passed before ever in the country. Mm-hmm. What do you think was the impetus of that? What was the change? I know my mom had some tactical strategies that were very effective, but what would you say was the public sentiment that changed their attitude?
Well, I think it reached the point where what we were doing, at least in funding programs, wasn't having an effect, and the personal tragedies were growing. So organizations like RID, like MAD, made it very personal. And they built a groundswell of support, a grassroots support for change. And that's how you get change from laws. Political permission then was built up that way, public demanding, we're not going to take it anymore. We have to change this system. Where it was taking way too long to get a conviction for DWI, the fines were very low, and the sentences were very low. And they were saying, we need to be swifter, there needs to be a better punishment program, better rehab programs, and it just, you need a better program here. And that's what RID did. That's what Stop DWI did. It was the first state in the nation to do something like that. To give you an idea of the magnitude of the change, About $21 million was generated annually through stop DWI fines. Every penny went back to the counties where the DWI offense occurred. That was so unusual. You don't see that. The state didn't get a penny. Even the money generated by state police arrests goes back to the county. The county then distributes that out, giving some money to state police troops in their area as well. So this was really watershed event, watershed legislation. No other state has been able to replicate something like that. That 21 million dwarfed the amount of federal funds they were receiving. And that's why you saw such an impact in New York State.
Well, one of the tactics, and I don't know where she got this idea, it was pretty, she showed a lot of moxie in doing this way. She went on every legislator's desk and put a note that says, if you vote for this bill, I know you're a lawyer in some capacity, you're benefiting from this, it's a conflict of interest. I will notify your constituents that you have a conflict of interest if you vote against this. And she couldn't have done this today because she was able to go around and the security definitely would have thrown her out in today's world. But that was like a very bold tactic, but I think it was in conjunction with the groundswell of support for her. She couldn't have gotten away with that if she didn't have the public support.
Well, don't sell it short. She made it personal, and that groundswell of support was a direct result of her efforts. Senator Smith listened, and we got that legislation in New York State because of that kind of thing. She made it personal, number one, which is a key ingredient, but she never took it personally. When she had obstacles, she confronted them. She addressed any negative impact that might have resulted from the legislation was addressed through science and allies. So your mom didn't do it alone with your dad. They built this support of grassroots organizations across the state, and then Mayor did the same thing across the nation. And that's what the politicians listened to. That's what the public got angry about and said, we need to change this. The general deterrence theory that came out of this whole movement about swift punishment, not delaying punishment for a year where the offender forgets what it was about by the time he got to court, and have a severe enough fine to have an impact, and then to take that money and put it back into a systems approach, which included training for police, prosecutors, judges, included public information campaigns, included education.
Roadside checkpoints?
Sobriety checkpoints is probably the most effective means for enforcement today with high visibility enforcement, because you don't have enough police to arrest every drunk driver. And the way you can have an impact on behavior in a community is when they see a checkpoint, and there's a general deterrent that happens here where they say, if I drive drunk here, I will be caught. And so that was the key of this whole program, was to have an impact on people we could never arrest. We would never have enough police to arrest, but to let them see that there is that possibility of arrest here.
All right, let's talk a little bit about the process of advocating for these laws. Back in the 90s, I remember my mom and RID members would meet with the legislator and the alcohol industry in an informal setting to work things out before it got to a hearing. Now, I think it's a very different culture. They're separate camps. You don't get to see each other until the hearing is there. So there seemed to be much more a conciliatory culture that is not existing today. Do you see that too?
I think you're right. I think the political climate, no doubt, has changed. Anybody who turns on a TV can see that. But I think the points that your mom made, that RID continues to make, is that it's in industry's best interest to support these laws. It's not a competing goal that we're looking at here. We're talking about saving lives. There's a body of research that says when we lower BAC limits from 1.0 to 08, back in the 90s, and by 2004, I think every state had an 08 law, we save anywhere from 8 to 12% of lives a year from alcohol-related fatals in those states. The industry is spending $6 billion a year in losses because of alcohol-related fatals of their employees 80% of those crashes are occurring off the job. So it's in their best interest, again, to support laws like this. There's no competition there.
That's a great point. I can't believe I didn't think of that before. You just mentioned that. That's a great point.
And so the fact that the two camps are not meeting ahead of time, I think, can be overcome by having the conversation, even if it has to be public, that there's no competition here. We're not talking about banning alcohol. We're not talking about closing restaurants and taverns. That didn't happen. That was the same red herring that was raised when we went from 1.0 to 08, that this was going to have a negative impact. It never occurred. They just did a study in 2017 that looked from 82, which is when all these laws started to happen after RID and MAD, right through 2010, and it showed that alcohol consumption did not come down and arrests didn't go up. The same thing happened in Scandinavian countries, that some of them, Netherlands and Sweden, have lower BAC limits. Netherlands, I think, is at 02, 05 in Sweden, and consumption hasn't gone down. When you looked at consumption, the WHO did, it's identical to the United States consumption, actually a little higher in the Netherlands. And yet alcohol-related fatals here in America are 31% of our total fatalities on the road. 31% are alcohol-related. Over there, it's 19%. So again, you can see that it didn't mean that restaurants were going to close. People learned, if I'm going to drink, I'm not going to drive. And it's as simple as
And
that.
now you have Uber and Lyft.
There are options.
Yeah.
And so these red herrings that it's going to, reduce consumption, it's going to put people out of business, didn't happen. And it didn't happen in Europe as well. You have over 100 countries in the world at 05 now or lower. And so you have WHO, you've got the American Medical Association, you've got the NTSB, you've got the Academy of Sciences. With research now, everybody's supporting lowering BAC limits. It's just good policy. You won't put anybody out of business, but you will save lives.
Yes, and what I really appreciated was the stats that came out of Utah that were very specific. And when you say that alcohol consumption didn't decrease, there's always wiggle room for them to say, well, maybe, that it didn't decrease, but they were very specific with this Utah stat that said sit-down revenue in a restaurant that's very precise, and that went up after this law was passed, I believe by 8%. So,
William, that's a very good point to make. The industry had ads before this legislation became law. It said, come to Utah on vacation, leave on probation. And so this is the scare tactic that they employed. And big ads in magazines like this. Well, that didn't happen. And this was their perception. This wasn't based on science, but those were the tactics that were employed by the industry at the time. And so you make a very good point. It's only 3 months of data from Utah because the law just went into effect, in the beginning of this year. So we don't know yet, if it's a scientific proof of the event. But the first 3 months,
it's a hard number.
The first 3 months, we saw arrests the same, we saw consumption the same. That was the other thing. Oh, arrests are going to go up, and we're going to get, innocent people caught in this net. Now, one of the points they always make is that the average BAC of arrest at 1.6 or 1.5 hasn't changed. I made the point earlier about not enough police to arrest every drunk. So what happens is we're arresting those that are the most egregious, the most obvious. But the research over the past 20 years for lower BAC laws in Europe and here shows you have a deterrent effect across low, medium, and high BACs. So this is a law that will have an impact on high BAC driving, medium BAC, and low BAC. And so again, the science is proving that wrong as well.
Could you talk a little bit about your work on the .05 Saves Lives Foundation?
So after I retired 4 years ago from the government, you can't lobby when you're working for the government, and you have to be neutral on all issues. I was approached by the former chair of the NTSB, Bella Dinzar, who you've had contact with, and Bella asked me, she said, gee, Tom, I'm thinking of starting a coalition, which is another technique that you use when you want to see social change. Would you co-found it with me? And I said, of course I would. I was retired from the government, and it's the .05 Saves Lives Coalition. And
Are you a 501c3?
and not yet. Bella's working on all of that. I'm not a registered lobbyist. I'm advocating at this point. But that coalition, started. She worked with Utah to get the law there when she was still with NTSB. We have now partners in Michigan. We're working here in New York with you to try to see, we're advocating for these laws here in the state. And so that's how basically how I got involved in this coalition with the O5 Saves Lives Coalition.
Another change that I've noticed that's a good one is that there's much more resources available to help states. With Bella was very helpful in working with the meeting we had with Senator Tedesco, and it just seems that they're being much more proactive and engaging with the people on the state level and on the grassroots level.
Right.
And
right.
that's a good thing. I just saw though someone from NHTSA testify on road safety, and so I kind of was flipping the channels and I stopped to watch what he was saying. And he just gave a sentence to saying, and we're recommending lowering the BAC. Didn't elaborate on it, and the senator or congressman who were listening to this were not curious at all to say what's the impact of this, why is this a good idea, and I thought that this is the most significant thing that we're trying to pass now, and it gets really short shrift. I mean,
You're right. And that's a shame. You have a countermeasure, a 0.05 BAC, with research that says you can save 10% of the lives. 1,700 a year in America. Here in New York State, because we have about 1,000 fatals a year on crashes, you got about 300 of those are alcohol related. So you would save 30 lives here in the Empire State. And the fact that there isn't greater interest, because very few countermeasures can produce that kind of return, that kind of life-saving potential. So it is shocking in a way, but I think that's the sense of politics, is that they didn't want to get out in front on anybody on policies. NHTSA funded the Academy of Sciences study that made this recommendations for O5. And again, the law itself isn't going to save lives. You got to couple it with enforcement, checkpoints, high visibility enforcement. So the public knows we're serious. There's a program tied to this campaign. Just can't have an empty slogan campaign that's not tied to something on the ground.
okay, well, speaking of slogans, I wanted to get into you with that, and that is this idea of messaging. It seems that there is a real distinction between capitalism and that kind of messaging and the government's messaging. Now you look at something like in the Capitol example of Coca-Cola. They changed their formula, the Republic revolted, and they changed right back within a few weeks after it said that was a bad idea. You look at Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk. Very effective. It was so brilliant on many levels, where you had millions of people recruited to take an active role when they see their friend starting to drive drunk. Now, then I think the people felt, well, we need to give the next generation a new slogan, and that was buzz driving is drunk driving. And despite, I don't understand the reluctance on NHTSA not to go back to something that was so effective. So I see in capitalism they lost lots of money, and they said, okay, let's go back to what worked. Government, we're seeing that this worked, it was really effective, but for the sake of change, let's stick with this and not go back.
Well, you said things changed, and the other thing that changed too, I think, is the body of research on marketing. And so in the early 90s, NHTSA learned through market research is that to change adult behavior, you have to provide a consequence. And so what you saw through the 80s was this click it or ticket, okay? If you don't buckle up, you'll get a ticket. And it was combined with very high visible enforcement of writing tickets for not being buckled up. So it wasn't a slogan like buckle up for safety. It was click it or ticket. You had a campaign, an air campaign that was tied to a program on the ground. We saw seatbelt use skyrocket in addition to laws being passed. The lesson from that was taken to the alcohol messaging that we had. While Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk was a good message, it really wasn't having a big impact on drunk driving.
You don't think so?
Well, we saw high
I
numbers.
mean, you saw
40
an increase when they abandoned it.
Well, we saw a decrease when we went to drive sober or get pulled over, or where there was a consequence around these campaigns in May or around Labor Day that said if you drive drunk, you will be ticketed, and the public saw checkpoints. And so you'll notice now in May there's a big national campaign for buckling up, and you see police out. And you see the same thing around July 4th and around Labor Day and then around the end of the year holidays for drunk driving. You can't do that year round because the public does get smart eventually. You have to have those reminder campaigns, and the social messaging of friends don't let friends drive drunk or the buzz driving can be brought back periodically. But you still need to tie that message with some enforcement thread.
Right. I guess I don't see the wisdom of buzz driving is drunk driving. It doesn't seem like there's no action you're asking
Right.
someone to take. And I'm not saying it has to be friends drive drunk, but just I think you touch on something when you say that the combining the component of the consequence within the messaging.
Well, that's why you'll see the drive sober or get pulled over, and you'll always see flashing lights. So you'll see a police officer approaching a car on the driver's side to do a test at a checkpoint. And so you're not going to see it all year long, but you will see a thread of enforcement in these messages in addition to the social messages. Now, what NHTSA does now, I'm no longer with NHTSA, but much of their, and NHTSA, by the way, has authority to spend money on media, which is unusual for a government agency. So there are paid media funds that are available to the states, where in the past it was always public service, late at night, whatever was unsold by a network. But now the states and NHTSA can spend money, and a lot of it's being spent on the social media, on the web, on things that maybe you and I don't see, but the target audience of young drivers might see. In video games, many video games now have messaging tied in on some of them, where you'll see a billboard or something about drunk driving or about click it or ticket. And so it's a whole different, I guess, landscape now for marketing on how they do it. And so I think the point was things change a little bit. We still have this, a messaging that's a little softer, a reminder. But for the most part, to change adult behavior, you need to say there's going to be a ticket here. We know we can change children's behavior for crossing the street correctly with education. Education alone for adults doesn't work as effectively. So an adult needs a little bit more than just education. There needs to be some consequence tied to it. At least that's what the research was showing us.
Do you have any comment on the comparison between the capital example that I gave and the government?
I think selling toothpaste and soda, things that are expendable or things we may not need is a little bit different than talking about a behavioral change. I'm not an expert in this, so other than that, I can't comment.
Okay, then I wanted to touch upon autonomous vehicles. And I don't know, did you go to the Lake Placid
I
stuff?
did not, no.
Okay, well, Terrence McConnell, who's a trooper that's been studying this,
I know him.
from the inception of autonomous vehicles, laid out this model that they're pretty much in agreement on, that the person in an autonomous vehicle, the driver wouldn't have to have a license. All the responsibility would go to the registered owner. Now that could be the same person, but it doesn't have to be. So he gave some very stunning statements saying that this is the silver bullet that's going to change. It's a game changer, and he says because of 97% of accidents are due to human error, you're reducing that so significantly that these things that will improve over time through technology will have a huge impact on that. How do you see the autonomous vehicles affecting drunk driving?
Well, you're familiar with the DADS program, the driver alcohol alert safety for safety, the DADS program, which is a passive alcohol program, senses alcohol through touch of the steering wheel or through sampling the air around the driver, and then would prohibit the vehicle from starting. Completely passive, and instantaneous. That's a few years away, but that's got promise for bringing technology to bear against drunk driving. So it wouldn't be like an interlock that you have to be convicted of a DWI now to get an interlock in your vehicle, although they are effective because they're video monitored also. But you see technology, at least in the future, will come to bear, and the manufacturers, I believe, will start to embrace it. Some are already. Now, autonomous vehicles, personally, I think there's a moral imperative to pursue that as quickly as we can. I mean, the end goal is to take the human out of the equation. You use the number like 97% of crashes are human. It ranges anywhere from 90 to 98. But let's just say it's a big number. And if you can take the human out of the equation and eliminate error, certainly that can be the silver bullet. Now, that's down the road. To turn a fleet over is going to take at least 20 years. So in the interim, you have a lot of vehicles now with advanced driver assist technology. Those vehicles that sense lane departure, correct the vehicle. Those vehicles that do auto braking, stop the vehicle before the driver takes action. I think that's the transitional thing. But certainly autonomous vehicles are transformational. That will change, driver safety, roadway safety. But it's not just the vehicles. You have to have connected roads. So there's a big infrastructure investment we're looking at here, where you want a vehicle to talk to the road. There's a turn coming up ahead. The pavement is wet. You want vehicle-to-vehicle communication. So all of this is years away, where one vehicle says to the other vehicle, I'm here, you're there. We're approaching the same intersection. So this idea of technology being the panacea, yeah, but it's in the future. And yeah, there is a moral imperative to get to it as soon as we can, because it will take error out. And so that's what is coming down the road. But I think in the meantime, you're seeing more vehicles coming in with this advanced driver assist technology, which will do many of those things by still having the driver, being alert and being, able to take over the vehicle when they have to.
Okay, let me just wrap this up with one last question. And given of all the direction that we're going and all the competing interests that you see in front of you, are you optimistic about the future?
I'm always optimistic about the future, William. Look how far we've come in roadway safety. In 1966, Congress passed the first Highway Safety Act, and 60,000 people were dying on the roads back then. 37,000 people died last year on the roads. The progress has been unbelievable. Federal motor vehicle safety standards that started to come into effect on glazing, on bumpers, on brakes, on all the equipment in the vehicle, the hoods, making them more pedestrian friendly. When pedestrians have to be optimistic.
And despite the fact that it's been such a stubborn, consistent problem.
Yes, we've been stagnating for 20 years now on the alcohol number. It's remained solid for 31% of the total. But I'm optimistic because I think things like '05, campaigns like that are going to take off eventually to change it. Now, autonomous vehicles, we said, something coming in the future. You've got to be optimistic about that. But they won't control for pedestrians that make mistakes. They won't control for bicyclists that make mistakes. They won't control for motorcyclists that make mistakes. You can't control everything, but we'll do it gradually. You have autonomous fleets now operating in Europe, so you'll see trucks come on board, limited highways, so they won't be in very busy urban areas, but you'll see this come, and I'm optimistic about this change. Have to be.
Okay, well, that's good news, and I'm glad you were able to come here and enlighten our audience.
Thank you for
Thomas
letting me come
Louizou.
up. Thank you, William.
I'd like to thank Kathleen Campion, who is the sponsor of this show, and it also heads up Linda Campion, who runs the Kathleen Campion Foundation. So until next time, we'll be looking down the road. Thanks for tuning in.